Massive thank you as always to our top tier patron, Sarah Turner. It's Not Just In Your Head is hosted by psychotherapist Dr. Harriet, substance use disorder counsellor Ecoy Hero, and myself, the editor and producer Liam Tate. This podcast is entirely funded by listeners, and as the famous meme states, we are critiquing capitalism because we are forced to participate in it in order to survive. So, if you can afford to give, then your contribution will ensure that we can keep making the show. However, if you can't, then please just leave a review on your podcast platform of choice, tell your friends about us, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, or YouTube. Massive thank you as always to Elle for organising our monthly reading groups and episode discussions, which you, dear listener, can join in too. Just head over to our Eventbrite page, and the link is in the show notes. This week we talk with Daniel Maté, co-author of the phenomenal book, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness and Healing in a Toxic Culture. We discuss the process of collaborating on this book with his father, Gabor Maté, Daniel's perspectives, his professional life, and the power of walking, talking, and music. Yes, dear listener, it's the moment you've been dreading. However, if we want to keep making this show, then we need cold, hard cash. So if you want an advert-free listening experience, come join our Patreon. Until then, endure this fairly innocuous advert for Spotify. Want to make a podcast?
Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere and even earn money, all in one place for free.
It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works.
Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer, so no matter what your setup is like,
you can start creating today.
Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify, and when you want to take conversations with your friends to the next level, Q&A and polls are the best way to get them talking. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's totally free with no catch. Ever since I discovered Spotify for Podcasters...
Personal statement example, I feel like having options like video podcasts and Q&A and polls has let me be creative on another level.
I highly recommend you give it a try.
Download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
We can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
The book is really broad. It really covers like a whole bunch of stuff like that are very self-reflective for the reader. I was just blown away by it. And I was going to say speechless, which isn't very useful for a podcast.
The first thing I did on the project was to help craft the book proposal. It was about 3.5 years to the project's completion. But I only got on board about 6 or 7 years into my dad's long trek of collating the information, crafting his thesis, figuring out, does he have anything to say? This book took him a lot of time and blood, sweat, and tears. It was not a slam dunk for him. He knew he had it in him on a certain level, and it was the kind of project that was broad enough and ambitious enough, and I think in a big way, personally meaningful enough. And it was enough of a risk for him. His other books, he knew he was on pretty solid ground. He was staying within areas of personal, clinical experience. Of course, there's lots of that in this book, but there's also a much broader sociological critique and relying very much on the work and research done by many others. He did something like 500 interviews for the book. He collated and organized into very organized subfolders and folders, about 25,000 articles and papers. It was massive. And much of that, not all of it, but much of it had already been accomplished by the time I came aboard. So I can only claim participation in the culminating phase of an accumulated project, which was to say getting the thing done and getting it written. At one point, my dad sent back the advance he had for the original contract for the book because he just decided this is beyond me. Then he refigured his title and his thesis. It was originally going to be focused on, it was going to be called Toxic Culture, How Capitalism Makes Us Sick, which sounds more like a screed than a book about trauma, illness, and healing, which is what it ended up being. And of course, the role of capitalism and its dictates and its belief systems and ways of life that it imposes on us, the impact of that on our health is or part of this book, but it's only a part.
Yeah, because it's quite a radical message, really, because it definitely feels like more than one mind has gone into this. It really feels extensive. And the radical element, I'm just imagining, because obviously there's a lot of acknowledgement of Gabor Maté's work, and it's to come out guns blazing and just say capitalism's causing all of this, a huge amount of death and despair, and all of it is, it'd just be interesting to see how the world is responding or has responded to it.
You can look at the New York Times bestseller list on the one hand, and you can also look at the fact that it hasn't been reviewed in any mainstream publications to date. So on the one hand, on the popular level, no, there's been no mention of it in the book section of, maybe the LA Review of Books did a feature on him or something. I can't remember, but that was like a guest contributor. New York Times hasn't touched it. I think The Guardian might be doing a piece about him. I'm not sure. But you look at Noam Chomsky, who's often cited as the most quoted living intellectual. And as Chomsky says, they never complete that sentence, which is to say, he's either ignored or derided by mainstream literati and public intellectuals. I'm not saying, and my dad doesn't have his level of notoriety and certainly he hasn't been famous for as long as Chomsky. But when you present a message that's subversive to the system inside which you're publishing it, I expected that part. What I didn't expect was the immediate popular reaction to it, which has been overwhelmingly positive. If you look inside the book, the breadth and volume of blurbs we got from a really impressive roster of thinkers and celebrities and writers and stuff like that spoke to the fact that it certainly did connect. Look, I think it's a little reductive to say capitalism is the cause. The word cause is problematic. There was a great paragraph in the book that unfortunately we had to cut, but I wrote it and I was very fond of it and we all liked it, but it just ended up beating the point to death. And also our original draft was twice the length, if you can believe it. So it would have been 1,000 pages, but it was a man falls off a cliff. What caused it? A physiotherapist would say it was the insufficient rehab on his sprained ankle. A geologist would say it's cliff erosion, and a bunch of other examples. And finally, the bear who chased him to the edge of the cliff would point a claw at himself and say, it was me. And so cause depends where you want to start the story and what you want to focus on. It's like the blind man and the elephant. However, what we can say, controversially, is that capitalism, globalized, late-stage capitalism, is the context in which the phenomena we're describing are taking place. It's the context of contexts, as somebody said. And so whether or not you want to blame it for it or call it the cause is not so important. What is important is to draw the connections, the correlations, and make the argument that in some ways it's inescapable that all these other causes would show up as effects of the super system. So we're trying to draw people's attention to connection rather than cause. Just like we don't say trauma causes illness, but it predisposes to it strongly, and it's correlated to a degree approaching 100%. That doesn't mean it causes it, but it's not a necessary thing to prove cause when you can show connection. And on a deep level, I think many people understand this connection already. We're just giving them some evidence to flesh out their intuitions.
Yeah. And that evidence, again, just as a general reader, the evidence, the connections between adversity, stress, and then various ailments of the body and cancers and stuff, I didn't quite understand how concrete all of that stuff was. It's not a surprise to Ikoi, obviously, because we spoke about that the other day, but to me, it was like, oh, geez. It's describing, was it people with...
The nicest people, yeah.
Yeah, and it's their nurses that describe that way, and the nurses can predict based on personalities on the intake forms who's going to, and I can't remember if that was the ALS study or the breast cancer study, but either way, with great accuracy, blind, they can generally assume or deduce with great accuracy who's going to get sick and who isn't.
Yeah, I've also heard that coming from nurses that work with autoimmune disorders. Heard in passing with conversation, several of them say that, oh yeah, there is definitely a certain, what was the word she used was like behavior. One of the things that I really enjoyed about the book, I work as a substance use disorder counselor, and one of the big things is we talk so much about, quote, biopsychosocial.
George Engel's phrase.
Yes. One aspect of how Biocycle Social is deployed, at least in my neck of the field, is like bio is seen as like the genetic and that's it.
Right.
One aspect I think of oftentimes treatment, whether it's medical or mental health, is that oftentimes people are passive subjects. Or they're treated like they're passive subjects in their own healing, right? So you go see a psychiatrist and you get like this diagnosis and you get a bag of medications. And again, I'm not anti-medication. At first, people are often just, oh, okay, this is going to help me along. And then they go through a lot of stumbling blocks because they're like, man, like the meds aren't really working. What's wrong with me? Or they don't have the impact that I need, or a whole slew of things. One of the most important things you can do, I think, if you are in both like mental and physical health, is again to make connections for people in terms of like how all these various influences influence their life. Because in drug counseling, right, everything is a brain disease. It's like this reductive, this is what you have. It's a permanent chronic condition for life.
Right.
And again, there is often very much this desire, I think, in society. I don't think it's a human desire. It's a social desire to have a singular explanation for everything.
Yes. Trauma can become a singular explanation if we're not mindful about it. But at least in the case of trauma, we're getting to the root of something, and that it's demonstrably the case biographically for people if you take a close look. When it comes to the brain disease hypothesis, it's pretty much a superstition at this point. There's actually no evidence for it, just like there's no evidence for the chemical imbalance theory, even though it's clear that medications can help people. When you talk about something as the origin or the cause, it becomes a circular argument. How do you know this person has, or why does this person have AD? Well, there's a chemical imbalance. How do you know there's a chemical imbalance? Because they have AD. And honestly, guys, like this area of conversation is not really my specialty. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a researcher. So when I speak about this stuff, I'm speaking as the co-author of someone else's book, essentially. So it's not what I like to focus on the most in interviews, but I will say that what that ignores is all the very well-established science. And Liam, there's a very good reason you didn't know this was all so concrete. It's because Western medical science ignores itself. It ignores what's actually been established. All this stuff has been published in major publications, but it's not taught in medical school. And one of those things is the indisputable fact that even brain structure, in fact, most of brain structure, emerges under the influence of the environment. Genes are there, but how do genes get expressed? It's called epigenetics. The thing is that to make connections is always subversive. If you think of a show like The Wire, I don't know how many of you have watched that HBO program. What made The Wire such a bracing societal critique and so different than most cop shows or drug dealer shows is it showed how everything is part of the same super system. And ultimately, by the end of it, you couldn't find any good guys and bad guys. And it humanized everybody and it problematized everybody. But it showed, what's the catchphrase of that show? All the pieces matter. And when you get that all the pieces matter, then all of your reductive, superstitious explanations for things that are troubling, the finger has nowhere to point except at ourselves collectively and the things that we've taken to be normal and taken to be true. And we even quote The Wire at one spot in one of the chapters on capitalism, where Frank Sabatka says to his longshoreman buddy, what happened to this country? We used to make stuff, or I think he says make shit. We used to build shit. And now you just put your hand in the other guy's pocket. That's a bracing, broad, I think, true observation about part of what's ailing us. Making connections was really important. And part of my role on the book was to make sure that we weren't veering into reductive, this causes that explanations. Because the minute you give people, oh, this is the reason for that, or this is direct, now you just got a new simplistic scheme. Thing that is actually powerful is to be able to hold as much nuance as possible while seeing the biggest picture possible.
I really appreciate that. And in the book, The Neuroscience of Psychotherapy by Cozzolino, who's very scholarly, he does show that everything in your life changes your biochemistry. So the idea that there's a biochemical imbalance, so what? Everything creates it, and the whole society creates it. And I think part of the power of your book is that it shows that the time we're living in now, when the US empire is collapsing and people are murdering one another, it doesn't have to do with their chemical imbalance. It has to do with everything's out of balance here. I think it's enormously important what you've done, because you've not pretended that you were the voice of non-embodied reason preaching, but that you're human beings trying to make sense of an enormous complexity in which every aspect shapes every other. And that's an enormous contribution to the field, rather than a simplistic reduction. There's nothing essentialist about that. And so it's really good. It's not like some religion. Oh, yes.
Well, what's my dad's patented therapeutic method? I don't know if it's patented, but what's his proprietary therapeutic method called? Compassionate inquiry. Again, one of my jobs on the book was to make sure we were walking that walk. Very easy to become to be simplistic in your thinking when you're trying to diagnose a big problem. And I'm very heartened to hear you assess it that way, because the world doesn't need another guru or someone promising an easy 5 or 12 or however many step path to enlightenment or freedom or healing. Freedom starts with seeing the trap you're in with clear, sober eyes, feeling whatever there is to feel about that, and then opening yourself to some imagination about how else could it be. And from there, you can naturally move towards it. Healing is not some kind of lifestyle brand, and it's not a program. It's a force, and we can participate in it. We can get with its program, or we can try to impose ours. And the results will speak for themselves in either case.
That's really powerful. And I wanted to ask you, because Walk with Daniel is a practice that you have, why do you think walking gets to compassionate inquiry and understanding of complexity the way sitting and talking doesn't?
I don't know. I truly don't know. I didn't craft it based on some theoretical understanding of walking. I crafted it because I like walking with people. And a friend of mine, we were taking a walk on Vancouver Island 5 years ago now. And he said to me, geez, you're really good at walking with people. And I realized that it's always been the case for me. When I was a kid, my grandfather and I would walk in the woods in Vancouver at the University of British Columbia. And I was at my best when we were taking walks. And he had to keep me occupied while walking by talking to me. And we would count up to 1,000, trade off numbers. This is the kind of little verbal brain I had, and probably attention deficit disorder. But I don't feel the need to relate to that diagnosis in particular. But I certainly had many features of it. I've always, and then hiking with my family were the happiest times. I loved our hikes at summer camp. I love going for hikes by myself. When I first moved to New York, I walked from Kensington and Brooklyn to JFK Airport quite by accident. I just walked east and I found myself in Queens, and I was out at near Far Rockaway, and just something happens for me when I'm in motion. So when it comes to working with others, I'm at my best when I'm walking. I'm at my most attentive. I'm at my most flexible and supple in my thinking. And people have told me, somatic therapists and people who understand the brain, that the two hemispheres are working together. The corpus callosum is activated and whatever. I truly don't know. Now, I'd like to write a book about what I call mental chiropractic, which is the practice. Walk with Daniel is the company or the business or the brand for it. But mental chiropractic is what I do, not compassionate inquiry. Compassionate inquiry is what my dad does. Of course, there is inquiry in what I do, and there is compassion. But the compassionate inquiry is a therapeutic method, or a method of counseling or therapy. I guess what I do, you could call therapeutic, in the same way seeing a physiotherapist is therapeutic, or a chiropractor, ideally. The mental chiropractic metaphor is meant to convey that compassionate inquiry is very gentle. It's direct, but it takes some time. It involves going back to people's childhoods and having people inquire into what made them the way they are today, and to do so with gentleness and kindness. I can be gentle. I can also be pretty forceful, because with what I say to my clients is, I'm not trying to see you next week, unlike a therapist. If I have to see you next week, I have failed. at what I'm trying to do. Now, I have a therapist myself. Therapy is very important and very valuable, but that's a long-term prospect. That's a regular practice of getting in touch with one's feelings, telling the truth about what's going on in one's life, coming to have some long-term integratable insight into what made me this way and learning to have some agency. What I do with people is when you are stuck in a certain area of your life and you really have the hunch that probably it's your way of looking at it that's keeping you stuck. And if you don't have that hunch, I will impress it upon you because it's almost certainly the case. You take a walk with me and we have a conversation that's extremely intentional, which is that by the end of this hour and 15 or an hour and 40 minutes, by walking together, usually by phone, because people are all over the world, you're going to see it differently. And I'm not going to let you get away with not seeing it differently because you're the one telling me that your intention is to get unstuck. So we team up, we collaborate on, there must be some way to see through this fog of war that you're in, this fixed, habitual way of looking at this thing, which is completely keeping you stuck. And of course, that's part of its function. When we're stuck, there's a part of us that's happy to stay there because it's worked this far, even if we're miserable. So to come back to your question, when we're walking, we're in movement. And literally, with every step, you're changing your actual point of view back to the same place. Even if you do a loop, by the end of it, the light is different. It's a different time of day. The weather patterns will have changed. So it's never the same. And so that's a nice, and again, embodiment of what we're trying to do. So I just find that it works. It works for me. It works for the client. That's how I do it.
So that people are on their cell phones when they walk with you?
If they're not where I am, yes. And I've done walks with people in South Africa, Saudi Arabia, Australia, Iceland. I'm doing one with someone in Chile coming up soon. It's quite wonderful.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
How far and wide this thing is, especially since the publication of the book. People seem to find me from all kinds of places.
And it's also part of pop knowledge, walk and talk. Let's take a walk together, that people... There's that song, Let's Take an Old-Fashioned Walk, and what a tale could be told when we go for an old-fashioned walk. The idea of walking together is part of pop culture, but you've taken it a step further. But does that mean that after one walk, if your client isn't transformed, you're finished?
No, they can always come back. But it just is not the case that there's been times where I wasn't sure, and then the person will get in touch with me 2 weeks later to say, actually, it made a radical difference. Even if it's a subtle difference, that's radical. See, I don't need them to be transformed. I need them to be unstuck.
Yeah.
And this is why it's very important to identify two things at the beginning of the walk, and I will not proceed until we have it. And if that's all we do in the course of the walk, then that itself will be radical for them. Number one, identifying what is stuck, which is to say, if they give me some internal story, like I just don't believe in myself and so on and so forth, I say, okay, I got that. Now that's your internal subjective experience. If I was a fly on the wall looking at you, how would I know that you're stuck? How is it manifesting in your life? Where in your life is this thing showing its face and slowing you down or completely stopping you or stymieing you? So as long as we have that, we know what the metric, where we're going to look for the evidence of, are you unstuck at the end of this? Because if you're able to see that situation in a different way, that opens up natural avenues of new action, thought, feeling, and behavior, you're no longer stuck. Stuckness, by definition, is being stuck in one point of view and only seeing a very limited set, usually a binary set of bad options. All of a sudden, there's possibility. And a second sort of entry point to a walk with me, and we do this as part of the walk, is to set a specific intention for the walk, which is not a goal. A goal is something that'll happen after the walk. My goal would be to, after this walk, I want to have a new kind of conversation with my father, or I want to apply for this job and not have a panic attack, or blah, blah, blah. That may happen, that may not happen, but the intention would be an experience that you want to be present to by the end of this that has been completely missing in action. So my intention could be energy, it could be vitality, it could be freedom, it could be clarity. One woman said, my intention for this walk is to know my effervescence. And I loved that. It's esoteric and idiosyncratic, but to her, she knew what that meant. And I could sense when she was being bubbly and effervescent. And it was completely absent at the beginning. And we turned a corner in the conversation where she saw through something. She debunked. First of all, she exposed, she excavated, and then debunked an implicit belief she had, a working theory that she'd been operating from that she didn't know was a working theory. She thought it was just the truth. The minute she saw it as the sort of allegation that it was, all of a sudden she got free from it and she could see other possibilities. And her effervescence returned. So I set my goals. They're modest, but in fact, when you're stuck, even a modest shift, a small victory would be a radical thing. Plus, then you factor in the fact that any kind of stuckness in adulthood is very likely going to be an echo or an outgrowth. It's going to have some resonance with early wounding and trauma. Now, I don't get into that so much in my walks with people. I can sometimes speculate or say, if I was to ask you about your childhood in detail, which I'm not really going to, but I expect I would find something like this and that. Almost all the time, I'm pretty right on with that, which is to say you come by it honestly, which is to say that it's not particular to the situation. And when we have a small victory in the present, I believe this, I believe it, that it sends a message to the part of us that's in the grip of that trauma, which is to say it's an outside-in form of healing. It sends a message to the core, which says, hey, you know what? It ain't necessarily so, because the trauma is the fracture from the self. It's the limiting beliefs that we develop. And if all of a sudden we have evidence in the present on the surface that I don't have to believe that, and in fact, I'm safe without that protective mechanism and I'm more satisfied and the world doesn't end, then all of a sudden part of us gets the memo, like actual evidence that we're no longer in the battle, that childhood, that we made it out of childhood, because the part of us that's holding on to that doesn't know the past from the present, and it keeps living out the past. If we actually have a transformation, even if it seems like a minor thing, I think that has the capacity and the tendency to make itself more profound. And that's what people have told me as well. So that's what and I continue to learn about. I made this thing up. It's certainly influenced by a lot of things that I've been exposed to, but I'm finding the more that I do it, that's one of the merits of it, is that you don't go and heal the whole thing. It's not healing in that sense, but it's a blow for healing. It's a victory of some kind that can catalyze maybe a swifter, more elegant healing that involves actual results in your life, not just breakthroughs and insights.
Yeah,
Right.
we made a mistake by not recording this whole thing whilst all of us were walking. But then I guess there would be so much background noise, it wouldn't be so great.
I don't know about that. An interview is very good sitting. I've done walking interviews, and no, we're doing an interview. We're having a conversation. Now, if all three of you were stuck and you wanted me to get you unstuck, yeah, we better walk. And I'm only going to do it one at a time. I'm not going to talk to all three of you.
No group walking sessions.
No, not even with couples who are having trouble with each other, or parents and adult children. There's a father and son who want me to work with them. And I said, I'll work with you one at a time. You're not ready to be worked with together yet. You're each too stuck in your point of view. And I'm not going to participate in a dynamic where you're each trying to convince me that you're right.
Well, as you walk, it sounds like you jog the unconscious in the act of walking, which is interesting. That
very probably I jog the unconscious.
Yeah.
What do you mean by the unconscious?
Those things that make you stuck, of which you're not even aware.
Yeah, I'd say I jog that, but I don't know if that's directly the thing. It might be. I wonder. It might be that I feel like what it jogs is the observer who can make the conscious. I jog the healthy skeptical part, a different kind of self-awareness that can step outside of the framework and look at the framework. And then inside of that framework, we reveal, oh yeah, your unconscious has been producing this. But that on its own wouldn't, in therapy, yeah, you bring the unconscious to the surface, you feel it, you look at it. In this case, we go right for the part of you that is actually curious about, why am I so stuck? The deeper intelligence, the part of you that's dynamic and fluid, and that can recontextualize both the conscious and unconscious aspects of what's been keeping you stuck in whatever quagmire you're in. So I would say yes, Harriet, but not necessarily
It also has the side benefit that you are moving, and it shows you can move.
Yes, absolutely. And I've had people tell me that even taking a walk was a breakthrough for them because they've been sedentary, they haven't been moving their body, and it's really helpful for me too. Much of what I do is seated. I'm a musician, a composer. I'm at the computer a lot. I'm a writer. So getting outside once a day to walk with someone else and get out of my own head.
Outside yourself, so to speak.
Outside myself, but also jogging a part of myself that is very adept and very present and very committed to something. Because I just get I'm like a dog on a bone when I'm walking with somebody. When they tell me what their intention is, I'm like, okay, let's go get it.
Yeah. I think in order to do any kind of successful improving of people, or I'd call it healing, you have to give people the attention that they never got.
Yes.
So that they know that they're important.
Yep.
In the eyes of the other person.
That's right. And at the same time, I have not a few people disappointed so I have people, let's say from my hometown of Vancouver or where I used to live, Victoria in British Columbia, saying, hi, I'd like to walk with you. I live a few hours away. I say, oh, I don't live there anymore. I live in New York City. And they're like, oh, that's too bad. I was really hoping to take a walk with you. And I say, walking by phone is in some ways more effective. Yes, I'm giving you attention. I'm holding space, so to speak, to use that newfangled expression. But the most important thing is that you be with yourself. And having me as a little voice in your ear, what that means is I'm chiropracting your mind. And then when we hang up, you are left with this new you, as opposed to the temptation to make it about me or something that I said or something that I did. I disappear at the end of it, which is exactly as it should be.
Yeah, that's really good. I think it's part of the compelling character of Jiminy Cricket in Pinocchio.
Yes.
He ride around in right near Pinocchio's ear with a moral voice. As Pinocchio.
Always let your conscience be your guide.
Yeah. Let's walk with Jiminy.
This idea of getting unstuck, there was a bit in the book where you guys were talking about that the trauma wasn't the thing that happened necessarily, but the meaning you made from it or didn't. Again, maybe there's not really the exact precise words, but it's interesting the idea that the idea of getting unstuck is about, as you say, like the word changing your perspective. It's like a useful word, and it's literal because, like you said, you're walking around, you are literally seeing things differently. There's the clever gluing of a sort of physical act with the thing that you mentally need to do as well.
And even before you can change your perspective, you have to diversify your perspective. When you're stuck inside one perspective, you can't change your perspective. You can try, but the parking brake is on. The minute you can see that, because the reason is it doesn't think it's a perspective. It doesn't recognize itself as a point of view. It thinks it's the multiple perspectives. You automatically see that it's a perspective and that there might be some choice in the matter. The minute you do that, you're unstuck. I don't care. You can go back to your old way of seeing it, but what you're never going to unsee is that you're seeing it a certain way, and there are consequences to the way you see it. Instant karma, as John Lennon said, that looked through a certain lens. The world looks a certain way and you react a certain way to the world that you're seeing. This is what we meant when we quoted the Buddha saying, with our minds, we create the world. Of course, the flip side he didn't talk about was how the world creates the minds with which we create the world. In terms of what you said about trauma, the little aphorism is trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you. The trauma, and literally trauma means wound. It doesn't mean calamity or catastrophe or bad event. It's the wound that takes place inside of you. And the wound happens in your nervous system. It happens in your cognition. It happens in your view of yourself. It happens in your access to your full emotional repertoire. And then we build calcified personality traits around these fractures to cope for them, to overcompensate for them. And then they become who we think we are. So that itself, the personality itself, is in some ways a vector of stuckness. You're bound to get stuck because the personality itself is a plaster mold that we overlaid on top of our original self in order to survive adversity. And that adversity can take the form of traumatizing incidents. It can also take the form of, or it can take the form of traumatizing non-incidents, the good things that ought to have happened, like D.W. Winnicott said. So the stuckness that manifests in people's lives, you could say, is just a natural outcome of whatever stuckness their personality has sentenced them to.
Yeah, I guess there must be there must be a fine line between, what's the best way of putting this? So there's this idea then that there's in becoming unstuck, that you maybe become aware of other choices of framing a past experience or something you're currently carrying.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also this thing that exists in, I guess it exists in British culture or just any sort of capitalist culture of staying positive, as it were, toxic positivity. There was that book.
That's also American culture too.
Yeah, but it's that whole thing of, I can't remember I think the book was called Smile or Die, where it was about the author had got cancer and then was advised to have a positive outlook because that's the only way you're going to recover from this kind of thing. And so was then being forced to
Barbara Ehrenreich's book?
Yes, that's the one.
Yes.
Barbara Ehrenreich, this book was called Right-Sided. It's the same idea.
Yeah,
right.
I think
who recently passed away.
Right. Yeah. And so I just wonder, because that's where the fine line must be, right? Is between this thing of, with examples in the book of people who have like complete to medical amazement that they have been diagnosed with cancer.
Remission.
Yeah, that's the term, right? And they did it through their own path of healing, as it were. And so I'm just wondering what that fine line is, or if it can even be defined between, on one hand...
I don't know how fine the line is, quite honestly. I think it's a pretty clear line. If you think of the idea, first of all, in my dad's book, his first book on the connection between stress and illness, When the Body Says No, from 20 years ago, he had a chapter called The Power of Negative Thinking, which is a bit tongue-in-cheek.
Yes.
I don't think it's positive or negative to even presume that that smiling is, that's pleasant. That's nice, non-threatening. That self-suppression, which is just a compounding of the trauma that contributed to where you are. So the very notion, again, we have to look at how we're framing things. So the question of, should you be positive or should you be realistic? What does positive means to affirm what's so? But ultimately, thinking is neutral. I don't know if you're going to call something positive or negative, that's a value judgment, and you're assuming that your value system is correct. But every society and culture is going to have a different idea of what is beneficial to life and what detracts from life. The power of positive thinking is also predicated on your attitude creates everything, and it's an individualistic assumption. It's the same thing with the power of acceptance. Well, acceptance is very important. It's one of the 4 or 5 A's of healing that we list in the healing section. But there is, again, I don't know how fine the line is, but it's a fine line in the sense that we've been brainwashed into confusing the two. It's a pretty stark line, I think, between acceptance and tolerating, because acceptance accepts all parts of the situation, including the fact that this is fucking intolerable. If I'm in an abusive relationship, to accept does not mean, Om Shanti, this is how it is, this is how it has to be. That's not accepting. That's only self-rejecting. Accepting would be, this is where I am, and where I am is killing me and hurting me, and I am willing to stake my claim to say that I deserve better. And I can't prove that, but damn it, that's what I'm going to do with this life, is I'm going to insist that I deserve better, and my children deserve better. And I can accept that I can't change my partner, and I can also accept that all of my ways of coping with this, not just now, but my entire life, all my ways of shrinking and denying myself and quote unquote accepting the unacceptable, are bankrupt.
Yeah.
That's true acceptance. So I would just reject the framing of positive versus negative thinking, and I would say, to what extent am I willing to let go of illusions that are compounding the problem? That's it.
Right. So much about what gets labeled positive thinking, especially because it's endemic in a lot of therapy and mental health spaces is to stay positive, right? Is the main issue is that it's a coercive positive. This is how I want you to act rather than what are your needs, what are your concerns, what's going on with
100%.
you. And so that's the negative aspect of what gets viewed as like positive or negative, because it's just like emotions. There is emotions are what they are. There's no wrong emotions.
And that's why I never use terms like positive or negative in my mental chiropractic work. I talk about alignment. Is it aligned? Is it aligned with your actual intentions? And is it aligned with reality? And the good news is that if you want to fulfill your true intentions, you better get aligned with reality, because that's where the action is.
You know, one thing about like your walking practice, because it's something that I've discussed trying to get a grant for, is you have this dichotomy in treatment where you're like in long-term therapy or you have nothing.
Right.
It's one or the other. And if you go to a therapist and go, oh, I'm only interested in 1 or 2 sessions to just get this thing off my mind, they're just like, we don't work that way. So not everyone necessarily has the time or the money or the ability to invest in long-term treatment. And I think something like this is an incredibly important service that bridges that gap.
Oh, I'm glad to hear you say that. And not only does not everyone have the time, resources, or interest, but not every practitioner has the temperament or patience or attention span or interest or deep sort of well of endless empathy to see someone week after week and gently inquire into that's just not my jam. That's just not what I only do the mental chiropractic thing because I love it. What do I love? I love getting to the heart of something now and having it shift your perspective, and all of a sudden possibilities open up. That's the thing that's always turned me on. That's the moment when I started to get experiences like that's when I got really interested in what was possible in terms of my own personal development. Up to that point, therapists had really frustrated me. So I'm interested in supercharged conversations that make an immediate difference. Therapy can't do that, and it's not supposed to. And I can't do what therapy does, which is why I have a therapist for ongoing maintenance, ongoing inquiry, ongoing kind of balancing out and maturing. But yeah, I'd like to think that I'm providing a service that's needed and that's a niche that's not being fulfilled. And I get that when I say to people, look, first of all, I got to tell you, I'm not a therapist. And people breathe a sigh of relief and say, thank God, because I'm not looking for one.
A lot of times, when clients used to have one-on-one sessions where they had specific issue that was going on that they just wanted to workshop it. And a lot of times they would say in the end, like, oh yeah, whenever I was in treatment before, like oftentimes if I wanted to talk about something specific that was going on in my life, my counselors shot me down because it wasn't about drugs.
Every therapist has their lane. And if you were talking to my dad or someone trained by him, you start talking about a thing that's going on in your life, my dad's first question is going to be, what's the feeling? And they're going to say, I feel abandoned. He'll say, that's not a feeling. What's the feeling? Happy, sad, whatever. Okay, sad or stressed or whatever. Where do you feel in your body? My solar plexus. When's the first time you felt that? Is this a familiar feeling? Yes. When's the first time you felt it? It's always age 2, 3, 4. I've watched him work with people. Now, it's very powerful because for most people, that really goes to something that they need to see. For me, I am interested in the thing that's happening now. And I think no matter how wounded you are, I treat everyone, if I've vetted them right, there's some people who it's just not appropriate for me to work with because they need something else. But if you're coming to me, you can say, I'm stuck, I'm willing to get unstuck, and I'm willing to consider the strong likelihood that it's my perspective that's keeping me stuck. Then I consider anyone I talk to highly competent in the matter of looking in a new way at whatever it is that's going on now, factoring in their past, factoring in the fact that we're wounded and traumatized, having some compassion and leeway for ourselves. But ultimately, who's going to change that perspective but you? If it's not what happened to you, but what happened inside of you, one thing that opens up is the possibility of responsibility and accountability. And while that can sound threatening to some people, it can sound like self-blame or whatever, it's quite the opposite. It's the access to freedom and agency, which is another A of healing. It's the access to self-esteem and self-reliance, saying, you know what? I can count on I've got my own back, and I'm not stuck with anything I think. And that is a message to send to the self, I think.
I think so.
I think
I wonder if that would work with children who can't really see a perspective outside of their own.
Would it work with children?
Yeah, would it work with kids? Because
it would have to be modified. It would be less,
yeah.
And it would have to be modified in a way that I'm not sure I might be suited to it. I've walked with teenagers. Teenagers are able to themselves and ask questions about themselves. It just takes sensitivity to what's going to crack the code for this person cognitively. And for a child, it might be telling a story or an analogy or just asking questions, and maybe they'll realize it themselves. Adults are tough nuts to crack. I'm a pretty strong nutcracker, so I like that challenge. Because if an adult's gotten to the point where they can say, my God, I'm sick of myself. I'm just sick of this perspective. And I've walked with people who have talked about suicidal ideation, and I need to make sure that they're not actively considering it right now. What I'll say to them, I'll quote Adyashanti, who's my favorite spiritual teacher. I'm not much of a spiritual guy, but he's a very down-to-earth teacher, speaks very plain English. When someone asked him in a Q&A, what do you say to suicidal people? He says, it may sound counterintuitive, but what I say is, that's great. What is it in you that's ready to die? There's some perspective that you're carrying around that is stillborn, and it's dead inside of you, and it's killing you.
Very Buddhist kind of framing, yeah.
A very what?
Very Buddhist kind of framing.
Yeah, he's in that lineage. He's a Dharma teacher. Is why there really is no problem too profound, or there's nothing in and of itself that'll put me off of working with someone. It's a question of where are they at? What do they need in this moment? Are they willing to take it? And also, it's just a walk. It's just an hour and 15 minutes. Are you willing to take an hour and 15 minutes and see if you can see things differently? And if you could, might that be helpful? The answer is yes. Whatever's going on for you, let's go for it.
Yeah, I think that's
that for adults, but I don't know. I worked with children for a long time, and it's just like you have to split up your parents' qualities, your mother's into she's the evil stepmother or she's the fairy godmother, that it's very hard to see that the same person who's the fairy godmother is also the evil stepmother.
Yeah, I was talking to my sister about this, who's a PhD student at the New School, and she was talking about her research into kids and mixed feelings. Feelings is something that I did not grow up witnessing in my home. There was never a mixed feeling. It was all either black or white. That was the sort of level of emotional nuance that my parents were capable of at the time. It's not a strong suit in my family. Everything was either or. I can't tell you, when I got to university and started taking course on critical thinking and logic or whatever, or maybe it was even in high school, the International Baccalaureate program, started learning how to be thoughtful and consider ambivalence and consider different paradoxes and stuff like that. It was like getting a nutrient that I'd never gotten. And kids who have been deeply wounded are going to be especially prone to thinking in black and white terms. But I do think it's possible to have a conversation with a kid, because if you can direct their attention to what the effect is of how they're looking at it and how they actually feel and everything they've tried and how it just doesn't work. Kids are also imaginative. I think that might be the key with children. What I'm trying to do with adults is to wake up their imaginative faculties so that they, rather than being certain about something. See, when people say, I'm stuck, I'm uncertain, I'm vague, actually, it turns out they have a deep certainty about something, and they're being right about it, which is that I'm confused. If you can wake up someone's imagination and wonder and genuine not knowing and being okay with not knowing, then the brain's more human, flexible, supple qualities kick in and new perspectives get generated.
Yeah.
So I think that should be possible with kids.
Yeah, kids are a lot more flexible. I haven't worked with children, but clients have brought kids over, spend some time talking to them. And one aspect of that I try to bring when I'm talking to adults that I glean a lot from talking to children is, one thing about children is that they don't have these strong ideologies that kick off immediate defense systems. So you tell them new information, they're like, wow.
Oh, yeah. No, I've seen that. The first exposure I had to, what can I say, transformative education was a weekend course that I took 20 years ago called the Landmark Forum, which is notorious and controversial for various reasons, especially the way they market themselves. But quite frankly, they have a very good product. I don't love the way they sell it, but they have an excellent course that has a lot of integrity to it, except I think in the ways that exploit people's excitement to get them to shill for them. But it's not multi-level marketing. It's just a program that really makes a difference for people. It did so for me, quite despite myself. I fought it the entire way. But adults do the program. It's 3 days, and it goes from 9 a.m. to, it used to be 11 p.m. They've shortened it now. Kids do the same program. It ends at 4:30 p.m. And not because the kids can't handle longer, which they can't, but because the kids, you tell the kids, you know that you're full of shit sometimes? And kids are like, yeah. They just laugh. And teenagers, it takes a little longer. You don't use that language, but you say, do you know that you pretend, or that you use excuses to yourself, or that you have a story about something? They can immediately see it if it's presented in a way where they're motivated. They come for a reason. They don't come because the parent says you need this. They come because, just like someone takes a walk with me because they want to get unstuck, the kid's frustrated with their own performance at school. The kid's frustrated with their relationship with their sibling, right? So if you're actually present to your frustration, then someone points to you and says, hey, are you willing to look at this little glitch in your matrix? Are you willing to look at this little quirk of yours? Might that have something to do with it? Kids don't have the layers of protectiveness and defense and insistence and certainty that adults do. Now, of course, that makes them easier to manipulate. But if you're doing it right and you're being respectful of where they're at and you're doing it in their interest, I think you can have conversations, certainly, that would chiropract gently the way a kid is looking at something. But of course, the other problem with kids is kids don't have the kind of actual agency in their lives that parents do, or that adults do. With an adult, you shift your perspective. Now you can go and, within the limits of your material conditions, of course, economic, social, all that, you can make some new choices. Kids are subject to the wills and whims and dictates of other people. And so there's just a limitation.
When I worked with children, though, which I did for quite a while in a neighborhood family guidance clinic, I found that just from listening to them, they got better. Just listening to them.
Well, right.
And once they trusted me, asking them questions. And they was pretty simple. I remember this boy who was referred to me because they thought he was an arsonist because he tried to light his house on fire. And he was only 8. And after he got to know that I was safe, I said, so, Jamar, how come you lit those curtains on fire? And he said, I needed the firemen to come and save me. They come and save people.
Rational arson.
Yeah, it's child thing.
Yeah, it is. It's instinct and it's survival. And it's the protection.
He should have gotten out of there. It was a very unsafe household.
Yeah,
Just
absolutely.
The trust was enough.
That's remarkable.
Tell you something that would help.
Hey, folks, I'm going to need to say goodbye here. I need to hit the road. I'm driving to Philadelphia to go work on a musical of mine, which is my first love.
Yeah, if we have to close it out, so be it. I was going to ask a question about music, actually, but...
You can feel free to do that. Let me take a quick bathroom break. I'll answer a question about music, and we can...
Okay, good. We're ready.
Okay, I'll be right back.
Okay, no worries.
This is so exciting.
Yeah, that kid's story is amazing.
It happens in a lot of little ways. I had a client who was thought of as insubordinate because she threw her homework at the teacher. And the teacher had said, get it in as soon as possible. And all she wanted to do was send it airmail. But they had a different kind of logic. And if you understand their logic for why they did things, it's usually fairly sound for child logic, you know?
Yeah, it does make a sort of sense. A much more fun kind of sense.
Yeah. It does, and this kid with trichotillomania, where they pull out all their hairs, their hair on their head, their eyelashes, their eyebrows. She just wanted to be in charge of something.
Right.
And
self-harm is almost always often about feeling like they have no agency or control. Yeah, suicide, same thing.
Okay, yes, I guess my final question was, there is some kind of quote about music is the closest thing human beings have to magic. And I just wondered, to what degree is there any sort of synthesis between your experiences with the walking healing and being able to make abstract connections, shift people's perspectives, and how you feel about music, how you do it Is there any sort of crossover? Because music is an abstract. You can have lyrics and stuff, but generally speaking, it is a medium of abstraction that has direct sort of connection to feeling.
Yes, it is. And that's why I love it, and I need to nurture it in my life, because I'm very good with words. And of course, words were also a coping mechanism for me in childhood. And my mind, which is the regime of words, uses them in ways that can be beneficial and aligned, and it can also use them in ways that can be a fog machine. And music cuts through all of that for me. So sitting at the piano and allowing my fingers just to do their thing, whether I'm playing someone else's music or just improvising or composing my own. I have to say, though, the field of music that I have chosen to till is musical theater. And musical theater uses the abstract, ineffable power, magical power of music to tell very specific stories. Some shows are more abstract than others, but lyrics are the thing that drive a musical forward, and music is the thing that makes those lyrics sing. And then the underlying story, what we call the book of a musical, is what makes those songs have context and have impact. Doing that is a beautiful synthesis of various parts of me. And in a way, I have a double or paradoxical answer to your question. On the one hand, there's no synthesis at all, and I love keeping them separate. When I'm, for instance, last week, we met our band for the first time for this musical that I wrote and orchestrated for string quartet. I've never written for string quartet before. So 2 violins, viola, and cello, plus the piano. I got to hear my music played out loud. Now, if you could take that, the 8 hours I spent with those musicians last weekend, and I'll be spending another few hours with them this weekend, and then they'll be playing the show in a few weeks, listening to them just sight read my music, that I spent the same kind of detailed, extended effort my dad spent, or I spent writing this book with my dad, maybe not as much time, because that's a 500-page book, but it's a thick book for this musical score. I would, if it was a question of the experience of that versus the experience of co-writing a best-selling book about trauma, illness, and healing, it's not even a question. Being in a room, collaborating with people on a piece of art is far closer to my heart, which is to say, to the part of me that is original to me, that is particular to me, that is not connected with my family relationships, that's not nepotistic in the least, which, let's face it, my work with my dad, at least in part, is, and the fact that I'm on this podcast to an extent is, which is not to denigrate it at all. It's just a fact. That's the path by which I've come to have a public platform to speak about topics on which I'm not a professional expert. And then even the mental chiropractic thing, I love it, but I love it as a side dish to complement all the time I spend tinkering away at legato and staccato and chord symbols and choruses and verses. That is that is an expression of the core of me. So in one way, I love the fact that they're so disparate. It's like a different world. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, if there wasn't some kind of unity to them, I would feel very, I think, split in a not good way. And I've had to find what that unity is. But if you look at the content of my musicals, they're about people finding the meaning in calamity, whether it's a comedic show, as I've written, or an absurdist show, as I've written, or a very serious show like the one I'm doing now, which is an adaptation of the Russell Banks novel, The Sweet Hereafter, which is a very sad story. It was made into a Canadian film in the 90s. And it's a deeply sad story of a town going through unimaginable tragedy. But it's about the aftermath of the tragedy and what comes to light and what comes to the surface and the transformations and realizations that happen for the characters and the different ways that human beings cope. And it's not an accident that I choose shows like that, and that the intention of these shows, not consciously, I don't go into it with a mission. I just want to be true to the story, to the characters. I just want to find out what is the world of this show. But ultimately, what do I want to put out into the world? Understanding, compassion, a new point of view on things people thought they knew, more nuance, the ability to see the connections between all of us and between things that seem disparate. And ultimately, put an even finer point on it, what I do with people on my mental chiropractic walks and what I want to do for the audience in a musical, what I really hope for them is that they'll have a crystalline experience where something gets crystallized and crystal clear and translucent and more valuable. It'll have more worth to them coming out of it than going in. So I can take that, you could call it a calling, something that I'm here for in the world to produce more of, to hold space for, to advocate for. And if I do that in everything I do, and if I look at everything I do, I can see that you could say that it's an expression of that. And I choose to look at it that way so that there is some unity to it. So that I don't have to deal with imposter syndrome or worry about which do I need to choose. But in terms of deciding what to centralize as part of my professional identity and what I would choose if the chips were down, 100% the art. But the great thing is I've found the best side hustle in the world, writing books with my father that it turns out many people want to read. That's going to provide a level of security for me that most artists don't get to have. And I can invest some of that into doing things that if I wait for the musical theater industry to do for me, record a cast album or get actors together in a room or whatever it is, I can funnel resources from one part of my life to the other. And that, I think, at the end of all the downstream, I think music for me is the place where I want it to all land. And I would love to live a life where that was even more central.
Speaking of that funneling, do you have performances that we could let our listeners know about?
Yeah, depending on when this will be released, we have 3 performances in the first week of April, the 4th, the 6th, and the 8th at a venue in Philadelphia called Fringe Arts. The first 2 are at 8 p.m. The one on the 8th is at 5 p.m. And they can get tickets through the website of the University of the Arts, Brind School of Theater.
Would you write that down and send it to Liam so he could include it in the program?
Yeah, I'll include the link. Sure, I'll send it.
Sweet. Yep. Okay, that's awesome. I know that you have to go. I'm just wondering, would you ever do anything for video games? Because I know that there was a sort of finger waving at video games in the book. Video games can be narrative form. They are artworks, the best ones at least. And
yeah, I can't imagine what I would have to contribute, but so far the only thing I've done for video games is to own a Nintendo Switch for 3 years and play for about 10 hours a day. And the new Zelda is coming out soon, Tears of the Kingdom, and I might have to get myself another Switch temporarily. Because it totally takes over my life when I have it. But I don't love a lot of games. I'm not a gamer, but the games I love, and that was one of them.
Yeah, because it's a storytelling format depending on the genre, and music plays a huge part in video game stuff. And,
and when they write lyrics in these video games, they don't tend to be very good, so I can contribute that. Anyway, I should hit the road here I can make
Thanks
it.
Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Great meeting you.
Likewise, thank you all 3 of you, and let me know when this is coming out.
Yeah, we'll do. Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons, Rebecca Johns, Bruce Rogers Vaughan, Alexander Lashley, Sheena Belmas, Seamus O'Connell, Alex Placito, Alexandra McCormick, Wig Shaker, Elizabeth McKechnie, and Sean Venardo.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And if you want to hear even more from Harriet, check out her radio show, Interpersonal Update, on WBAI and in the WBAI archives.